Welcome to Christ's Word, where everyday lives meet the light of God's Word. Here, we don't preach. We tell stories. Moments of doubt, turning points, quiet revelations, all woven with raw emotion and unshakable faith. You're not just listening to someone else's journey. You might just find your own reflection in it. And maybe, just maybe, by the end, you'll discover the answer you've been searching for. It was a typical Tuesday morning, or so Jake thought. But then, everything changed in an instant. He never imagined that a single moment could shatter his entire world. The blaring sound of tires screeching, the twisted wreckage of metal, and the silence that followed, it was all too much to process. Jake stood there, frozen in place, as a young mother and her child were taken away in an ambulance. The accident wasn't just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. The weight of the world seemed to fall on his shoulders. For as long as he could remember, Jake had believed that the world worked in a certain way, those with money, power, and influence held the keys to everything. They made the rules, controlled the systems, and were untouchable. The rich got richer, the poor remained poor. It was an unspoken truth, a reality he had come to accept. But now, standing on the street corner, watching a life slip away, he couldn't shake the question that had been gnawing at him for years: is this really the way it's supposed to be? As the police and paramedics swarmed around the scene, Jake found himself thinking about something his grandmother used to say: what is justice, if not the balance between what we have and what we owe? But what did that even mean? Was it really fair that the strong trampled the weak? Was it justice that people could rise above others simply because of the circumstances they were born into? Jake's mind raced, and for the first time, he began to question everything. His whole life had been about securing success, achieving status, and playing by the rules of a system he now saw as fundamentally flawed. He had always known that society was broken, but the truth of it, the depth of its brokenness, had never truly hit him until now. What was he supposed to do now? How could he go back to his normal life after this? He felt as though something deep inside him had cracked open, revealing a void that he didn't know existed. The world he thought he knew had just unraveled, and Jake was left standing there, a shell of the person he once was. But even in his confusion, there was a spark, a flicker of hope, maybe. Could there be a way to fix this? But the real question that haunted him was, could a single person truly make a difference? Just when Jake thought he couldn't go any further, he stumbled across something he hadn't expected. A flyer, just a simple piece of paper on the ground, caught his attention. Join us. Stand up for justice. Let's change the world, one act of kindness at a time. It seemed harmless at first, just another protest group. But something about it felt different. The message was simple. The world can change. You can change it. With a mix of hope and skepticism, Jake decided to go. What did he have to lose? Little did he know, the moment he walked into that room would set off a chain of events that would not only change his life but could very well change the world. But first, he had to learn a truth about justice that would rock him to his core. Stay tuned. Jake woke up the next morning with a strange sense of unease that had clung to him ever since the accident. The images from the crash, the twisted metal, the pale faces of the victims, kept flashing in his mind. He tried to shake them off, but they stuck with him, gnawing at his thoughts, unraveling the fabric of the life he had always known. For as long as he could remember, Jake had lived by certain rules: work hard, succeed, climb the ladder. The strong survive, the weak stay down, and that's just the way things are. Or at least, that's what he had always believed. His family had raised him with these values, the notion that success came through hard work, ambition, and taking control of your own destiny. They had always praised him for his sharp mind, his ability to rise above the challenges, and his impressive career trajectory. Jake had done well for himself. He had the apartment, the car, the stable job at a marketing firm. He was even planning on taking a promotion that would cement his place in the company's upper echelons. It was everything he had worked for, everything he thought he needed to feel complete. But now, Standing on the streets of the city that had always felt like home, everything seemed meaningless. Jake found himself walking the same streets, heading to the same coffee shop he always went to, but today it all felt different. The world around him seemed to be moving in a blur, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just the accident, no, it was something deeper, something unsettling that had been eating away at him for years but had only now come to the surface. The city, with all its bright lights and towering buildings, felt hollow now. People passed him by, absorbed in their own lives, their own problems. He watched them for a moment, noticing how they all seemed to be rushing from one place to another, locked in their own little worlds. He had been like that too. He had been one of them. A cog in the machine, trying to climb higher, always moving forward, always thinking that if he just worked hard enough, if he just achieved enough, he would feel fulfilled. But here he was, standing in the middle of it all, and he felt empty. Jake had always known that there was inequality in the world, he had seen it firsthand, especially growing up. His family was middle class, comfortable enough to never really want for anything, but not rich enough to feel untouchable. He had grown up with the idea that hard work was the key to success, but he had also witnessed the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. He had seen the way the rich got richer, the powerful stayed powerful, and the rest of society simply struggled to get by. Yet, in his naivety, he had believed that if he just played by the rules, he could change his own fate, maybe even the fate of others. He had told himself that he was different, that he could make it, that he wasn't like the people who complained about the system, those who claimed the odds were stacked against them. He had always been determined to rise above, to prove that anyone could succeed if they worked hard enough. But now, standing on the sidewalk, the weight of the world seemed unbearable. He thought back to the faces of the young mother and her child, the way their lives had been changed in a split second, all because of a twist of fate. Was it fair? Was this what life was really about? Was this the system he had worked so hard to be a part of? And then there was the flyer. The simple piece of paper that had caught his attention on the street corner, the one that had led him to the meeting. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just another protest group, another call to action. But when he walked into that room, he felt something stir deep within him. The room was full of people, ordinary people, people who didn't look like they had much to their name, but whose eyes burned with a passion that he couldn't ignore. They weren't talking about the world as it was. They were talking about the world as it could be. The group wasn't just fighting for political reform or economic justice, they were talking about something more profound, something that felt personal, something that hit him where it hurt. They were talking about the possibility of a different world, one built on love, compassion, and forgiveness. It wasn't about overthrowing governments or tearing down the rich, it was about building something better, something that valued people for who they were, not for what they owned or how much power they wielded. Jake hadn't been sure what to expect when he walked into that room, but he certainly didn't expect the stirring sense of hope he felt. It was like a door had opened in his mind, and for the first time, he saw a glimpse of something greater than himself. The more they spoke, the more he realized how little he truly understood. This wasn't about fighting against something, it was about living for something. It wasn't about the system he had always tried to fit into, it was about creating a new system, one based on true justice, not the hollow, broken kind that he had always known. But even as the words rang in his ears, doubts still lingered. How could this be possible? How could any one person make a difference in a world as vast and complicated as the one they were living in? And even if change was possible, how could he, someone who had spent his life focused on climbing the corporate ladder, ever truly embrace this new way of thinking? The meeting ended, and Jake found himself walking back through the crowded streets, feeling both more alive and more uncertain than ever before. The world hadn't changed in the few hours since he'd sat in that room, but something inside him had shifted. He felt a pull, a desire to act, but he also knew that this new path would not be easy. It would require him to confront everything he had ever believed about success, about power, about fairness. And more than that, it would require him to face something far more daunting, the truth about who he was, and what he truly stood for. Jake's life had been turned upside down in an instant, and now, as he walked through the city streets, he realized that the journey ahead would not just be about changing the world. It would be about changing himself. What was justice? What did it mean to fight for it? He didn't know yet, but he was determined to find out. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope, because perhaps, just perhaps, this was where the real journey began. Jake spent the following days in a state of quiet turmoil. He couldn't shake the thoughts that had come rushing into his mind after the meeting. The more he thought about the group's words, the more they began to gnaw at him, pushing aside the doubts he had carried with him for years. For so long, he had believed that the world was structured in a way that was simply inevitable, rich versus poor, powerful versus weak, success determined by chance and circumstance. He had thought that the best thing he could do was climb higher, outpace the competition, and secure his own place in the world. But now, those beliefs felt like sand slipping through his fingers. It wasn't just the words from the group that kept replaying in his mind, it was also a quiet conversation he had had with his mother earlier that week. She had asked him, almost out of nowhere, "Jake, when was the last time you did something just for someone else?" Her question had caught him off guard, but the more he thought about it, the more the answer seemed obvious: never. Sure, he'd done good things, donated money to charity, volunteered at the food bank every holiday season, but those were all actions that still fed his own ego, actions he could justify by telling himself he was a good person. But his mother wasn't talking about those kinds of things. She was talking about something deeper. She was talking about real selflessness, the kind of giving that didn't come with strings attached. Jake didn't know how to respond to her question. How could he, when the very concept of selflessness seemed so foreign to him? For so long, his life had been about advancement, about proving his worth, about climbing the ladder. To live for others, to live with compassion and kindness without expecting anything in return, felt impossible. He tried to shake off the conversation, but it lingered. And then came the words from the group, echoing in his ears: "Justice is not a matter of taking from the rich to give to the poor. It's about recognizing the value in every person, and creating a world where love and compassion guide us all." At first, he had dismissed them as overly idealistic. It sounded like something out of a movie, not real life. But the more he reflected, the more it felt like a truth he had been missing all along. His head was spinning, and the world around him seemed to be moving in slow motion. He couldn't go back to the life he had known, the one where success was everything, where people were judged by their bank accounts and their power. He couldn't go back to the way he had lived, pretending that everything was fine when so much of the world was broken. Jake needed answers. He needed to know how to live differently. So, he went back to the meeting the following week. It was the same group, in the same room, but this time, Jake was different. His heart was heavier, his thoughts more focused. He couldn't deny it any longer, he wanted to be part of the change, not just someone who watched from the sidelines. He wasn't sure how, or even where to begin, but he knew this was where he needed to be. The group leader, a calm and kind woman named Sarah, spoke that day about the teachings of Jesus, about how they didn't just apply to the religious world but to every aspect of life. Jesus didn't just teach us about love and forgiveness in a vacuum, she said, her voice steady and clear. He taught us to live out those values in the real world, in the midst of struggle, in the face of injustice. He didn't tell us to turn a blind eye. He told us to be the change. Jake's heart skipped a beat. She was right. He had been waiting for someone to fix everything, to swoop in and save the day. He had been waiting for a solution to come from somewhere else. But what if the solution had always been right in front of him? What if the power to change the world lay not in external circumstances, but in his own heart and actions? Start with where you are, Sarah continued. You don't need to change everything at once. Change begins with small steps, with the way you treat the people around you, with the choices you make every day. When you act out of love, out of a desire to see others succeed, not just yourself, you start creating the world Jesus talked about. The room fell silent, and for the first time, Jake felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it meant to act out of love, but he realized that he had been looking for the wrong answers all along. He had been chasing success, chasing wealth, chasing approval from people who didn't care about him, let alone the world around him. He had been looking for fulfillment in all the wrong places. When the meeting ended, Jake stayed behind for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Sarah approached him, sensing his inner struggle. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes warm with understanding. Jake nodded, his throat tight. "I think so," he said quietly. "But it feels like such a huge shift. How do I even begin?" Sarah smiled gently. "You begin by trusting yourself, Jake. Start with small acts of kindness. Stop thinking about what's in it for you, and start thinking about how you can serve others. You'll begin to see the world differently, and slowly, piece by piece, things will start to change, not just around you, but in you." Jake took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off his chest. For the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, not just for himself, but for something much greater than himself. It wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. But the journey was beginning. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. A journey of faith, transformation, and unexpected challenges awaited him. But one thing was clear, he was no longer willing to walk the same path. The old Jake was gone. And a new one was just starting to emerge. The question now was, could he live up to the change he so desperately sought? Jake felt the pull of his newfound conviction stronger than ever. But with every step forward, the world around him seemed to fight back. The first challenge came only days after his decision to live differently. At work, Jake found himself standing at a crossroads. The promotion he had worked so hard for, the one that would secure his future in the company, was now within his grasp. But something about the whole situation felt hollow, as if it was a prize he was no longer sure he wanted. The project he had been leading was supposed to be his ticket to success, a multi-million-dollar contract with a major corporation. It was a deal that could cement his status, elevate him in the company's hierarchy, and give him the recognition he had always craved. But as Jake sat in the boardroom, listening to his colleagues discuss the contract's final details, something inside him stirred. He began to question the ethics of the deal, the way they were prioritizing profits over the welfare of the people who would be impacted by their decisions. The company's actions would hurt small businesses, harm the environment, and enrich a few while leaving many behind. He wanted to speak up. He could feel the words bubbling up in his chest, the need to say something, to take a stand. But just as quickly, doubt crept in. He knew what this meant. If he called out the decision, if he challenged the company's priorities, he would risk everything. His promotion, his career, everything he had worked so hard for, could be gone in an instant. He could already hear the objections of his colleagues, their dismissals of his concerns. "This is business, Jake. It's just the way the world works." That was the mantra he had lived by for so long. But today, those words felt empty. Today, they felt like a cage, keeping him locked in a system that had no room for compassion, no room for justice. Jake's pulse quickened. He was torn between his old life and the new path he had chosen, the one where love, compassion, and justice were his guiding principles. If he stayed silent, he would be betraying everything he had learned, everything he had come to believe. But if he spoke out, he would be putting everything at risk. He walked out of the meeting without saying a word, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a stone. It wasn't just the deal that bothered him, it was the realization that the very system he had worked so hard to succeed in was built on a foundation of inequality, exploitation, and greed. And now, he was trapped in it. His heart ached, torn between the life he knew and the life he wanted to live. Later that evening, as Jake sat at his kitchen table, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He felt like a man caught in a storm, his old beliefs and values crashing against the new ones he was trying to build. How could he reconcile these two sides of himself? How could he hold on to his integrity when the world seemed to demand compromise? His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from Sarah, the group leader. "How are you doing? I know this path is tough. Remember, it's okay to struggle. Growth never comes easy. Let me know if you want to talk." Jake stared at the message for a moment. He could feel the truth in her words, but the struggle was real, and it was becoming harder to bear. He hadn't told Sarah about the situation at work, he hadn't even fully processed it himself. But maybe it was time to share, to ask for help, to let someone else in. He quickly typed a response, "It's tough. I don't know if I can keep going this way. Everything I've worked for is at risk." Moments later, Sarah's reply came, "That's exactly what faith asks of us, trusting in what we can't see, and doing what's right even when it costs us. You don't have to do it alone. Lean on your faith, lean on the people who are walking this journey with you. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Jake sighed, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He had been so focused on the external challenges, the consequences of his decisions, that he had forgotten the one thing that had brought him this far, his faith. His faith wasn't just about believing in a better world, it was about living as if that world were already here. It was about making decisions based on what was right, not on what was easy. He needed to hold on to that, even if it meant letting go of everything he had built. The next morning, Jake did something he never thought he would do. He sent an email to his supervisor, explaining his concerns about the deal. He didn't hold back, he laid out the ethical issues, the impact on small businesses, and the environmental consequences. He even suggested alternatives that could achieve the company's goals without sacrificing the well-being of others. He wasn't sure if it would make a difference. But it felt like the first step towards something real, something worth fighting for. The response came a few hours later. His supervisor wanted to meet. As Jake walked into the meeting, he wasn't sure what to expect. Would he be dismissed as naive? Would he be told that he was overreacting, that business was business? But when he sat down across from his boss, something surprising happened. Instead of the usual cold professionalism, there was a moment of silence, a pause, as his boss considered his words. "Jake, I didn't realize how deeply this was affecting you," his supervisor said, his tone softer than Jake had expected. "I see where you're coming from. Let's talk about other options. Maybe there's a way we can make this work." Jake sat in stunned silence. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected a genuine conversation about change, about finding a way to do business without compromising his values. For the first time, it felt like his voice had been heard. It felt like his integrity mattered. But even as he felt a glimmer of hope, Jake knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be full of challenges, challenges from his co-workers, from the system, from his own doubts. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was fighting for something that truly mattered. This was his test. And he was ready to face it. In the coming weeks, Jake would face even greater challenges. But no matter how hard it got, he knew one thing for sure, the journey he had started was worth it. Because even in the face of adversity, he was living by a truth that could never be taken away, the truth that love, justice, and compassion were the most powerful forces in the world. And no matter how the world tried to push him down, he wasn't going to stop fighting for it. The days after Jake's decision to speak out felt like an emotional roller coaster. The initial relief of having voiced his concerns was short-lived, replaced by a new set of challenges that tested him more deeply than anything before. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching him, waiting to see if he would bend under the pressure or stand firm in the face of adversity. The first blow came when he received a call from his colleague, Brian. Brian had been one of Jake's closest allies at work. They had shared many late nights in the office, working on big projects, climbing the corporate ladder together. But now, the tone of his voice on the phone felt different, colder, more detached. "Jake, what you did, it's not how we do things here," Brian said, his words clipped. "You've put us all in a tough spot. The higher-ups don't take kindly to this kind of thing. You should have just kept quiet. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had expected some pushback, but hearing those words from Brian, someone he respected, made the weight of his decision feel even heavier. He had always thought of himself as someone who could navigate difficult situations with ease, but now, standing up for his beliefs seemed to have isolated him from the very people who had once been in his corner. The next day, Jake walked into the office to find an email from his supervisor, urging him to reconsider his stance. The company was moving forward with the deal as planned, and his concerns, though appreciated, had been deemed unrealistic in the face of the company's goals. He was told that pragmatism was required in business, not idealism. Jake's heart sank. It was as if his voice had been ignored, dismissed as a mere nuisance. He began to question everything again. Was it worth it? Was it worth losing the respect of his colleagues, his job, possibly even his future? He spent that night pacing his apartment, his thoughts a storm of doubt and fear. What was he doing? He had risked everything, his career, his reputation, for what? A fleeting sense of righteousness? It wasn't as if anyone cared. The world didn't work the way he thought it did. He was naive, foolish even, to believe that one person could make a real difference in a system so deeply entrenched in its ways. But then, as if by instinct, his thoughts shifted back to the teachings he had started to embrace, the lessons from the group, the message of love, compassion, and justice that had slowly become the foundation of his life. He had been fighting for what he believed was right. Was that not enough? Did he have to compromise his values just to survive? Wasn't there a way to live with integrity, even when the world around him seemed to demand conformity? It was then that Jake realized something profound. Change didn't happen in one big, dramatic moment. It wasn't about making one huge stand and then waiting for the world to applaud. It was about the small, everyday acts of courage, the choices he made each moment, each day. It was about consistency, about staying true to what he believed in, even when no one was watching. The next morning, as Jake prepared for work, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to give up, not now, not after everything he had learned. He wouldn't let the system crush his spirit. He wouldn't back down, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for everyone who had been taught to accept the world the way it was. That day, Jake made a decision. He wasn't going to just talk about change anymore. He was going to be the change, no matter what the cost. He called a meeting with his team. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was his. He sat down with them and spoke from the heart. He didn't focus on the business side of things. He didn't talk about numbers or profits. Instead, he shared his journey, his doubts, his struggles, and the new perspective he had gained on justice and fairness. He told them about the ideals he had started to live by, the things that had shifted his understanding of success. To his surprise, a few of his colleagues began to open up. Brian, the one who had scolded him, sat in silence at first, but by the end of the meeting, he was nodding, his expression softer. "I never really thought about it that way," he admitted. "I guess we've all just been going through the motions." Jake felt a small victory in that moment, not because he had convinced anyone, but because he had stayed true to himself. He had spoken his truth, even when it was hard, even when it felt like no one was listening. And that, in itself, was enough. As the days passed, things didn't immediately improve. The company continued to push forward with the deal, and Jake's future there remained uncertain. He faced whispers behind his back, side-eyed glances, and passive-aggressive comments. But instead of retreating, instead of falling back into the shadows, Jake became more resolute. He started volunteering with local nonprofits, using his skills to help amplify their voices. He found small ways to contribute to the world around him, whether through mentoring or helping to organize community events. He wasn't waiting for the system to change, he was creating change in the spaces he could control. And slowly, others began to take notice. One day, out of the blue, Jake received a phone call from his boss. It wasn't what he expected. "Jake, His boss said, "I've been hearing things about the work you've been doing outside the office. I have to admit, I didn't understand what you were trying to accomplish at first. But I'm starting to see it now. You're not just trying to change things for the better. You're building something that can last. I think you've earned a shot at something more meaningful here, if you're willing to take it." Jake was stunned, his heart pounding in his chest. This was more than just a career opportunity, it was validation. His choice to live out his faith, to stand firm in his convictions, had made a difference, even in the world he thought would never change. But even as the door opened, Jake knew the journey wasn't over. This was only one chapter in a much larger story. His path wasn't clear, but the truth was undeniable. He was no longer the person he had been when he first walked into that room seeking answers. He was stronger now, more certain of who he was, and more committed to living a life of purpose. He had chosen the hard path, and it had already begun to shape him in ways he never imagined. What he didn't know yet was how far that path would take him, or what sacrifices it would require. But for the first time, Jake didn't feel alone in the struggle. He was surrounded by people who shared his vision for a better world, and he knew that together, they could create something greater than he could ever achieve alone. It was a long road ahead, but he was ready. For the first time, Jake felt at peace with the direction his life was heading, because he was finally living with integrity, with purpose, and with the courage to make a real difference. Jake sat quietly at his desk the next few weeks, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The promotion he had once dreamed of was now just a distant memory. The office, with its bright lights and sleek glass walls, felt less like a place of opportunity and more like a cage. And yet, despite the uncertainty that loomed, Jake had never felt more certain about his purpose. The battles he'd fought, the long hours of questioning, the awkward conversations with colleagues, the deep self-doubt, hadn't been easy. They had stripped him of the man he had once been, the one driven by ambition and the need to prove himself. But in their place, a new version of himself had emerged, a man not defined by success in the eyes of others, but by the strength of his beliefs. It had been over a month since he first reached out to his supervisor with his concerns about the project, and though the company had pressed forward with their plans, Jake had found a sense of peace in knowing that he had made the right choice, regardless of the outcome. But that peace was not without its cost. His colleagues no longer looked at him the same way. There was a distance, a quiet judgment in their eyes when they spoke to him, as if they couldn't quite place him anymore. They didn't understand his decisions. To them, he had thrown away a future of wealth and influence for some idealistic dream. And yet, Jake knew deep down that he hadn't thrown anything away. He had gained something far more valuable than any promotion, any paycheck, any title. One afternoon, while walking out of the office, Jake received a text from Sarah. It simply read, "Hey, Jake. How's everything going? I know it's been a tough road. But you're making an impact, whether you see it or not." He paused, standing still for a moment. It was simple, yet the words resonated with him. You're making an impact, whether you see it or not. In that moment, Jake understood that change wasn't always immediate, and it wasn't always loud. Sometimes, the most significant impact was the quiet change within a person's heart. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was that change that would ripple outward to affect others. A few days later, Jake received an unexpected call. It was from Brian, the colleague who had criticized him so harshly in the beginning. Brian sounded different now, his voice full of hesitation. "Jake," he began, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About the project, about what you were trying to do. I didn't get it at first. I thought you were just being naive. But I've been noticing things, man. The way the team's been treating the smaller vendors. The way we've been cutting corners, pushing people around. I've been feeling pretty awful about it." Jake was silent for a moment, processing Brian's words. He could feel the weight of the confession, the vulnerability in Brian's voice. It wasn't easy to admit when you were wrong, especially when the system you had been part of for so long had promised you success at the expense of others. "I don't know what to do about it, Jake," Brian continued. "I've been so focused on climbing up that I didn't realize what we were doing to get there. But now, I want to make it right. I want to stand with you. What do we do now?" Jake's heart swelled with a mix of emotions. In the past, this would have been a victory, a moment to savor. But now, it felt different. This wasn't about winning or losing, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about two people who had been broken by the same system, who had come to understand the deeper truths of life. "You don't have to have all the answers, Brian," Jake replied, his voice steady. "It's about taking the next step. Start where you are. Use your position to make small changes. It's not about doing everything at once. It's about creating the right foundation. For both of us." As Jake ended the conversation, a sense of clarity washed over him. This was what he had been working toward. This was the change he had fought for, not the immediate acknowledgement, not the grand gestures, but the quiet victories. The ones that came when someone else began to see the same truths, when someone else was willing to take a stand, even if it was just a small one. Later that week, Jake was invited to a meeting with the company's board of directors. It was unexpected, and he wasn't sure what to expect. He walked into the room, his palms sweaty, but his heart calm. He had no idea if this would lead to a positive outcome, or if he would lose everything he had worked for, but he was determined to stand his ground. To his surprise, the conversation went differently than he anticipated. The board acknowledged his concerns, somewhat reluctantly, but they could see the passion in his eyes, the conviction in his words. They weren't ready to change everything, but they agreed to look into alternative methods. They promised to implement more ethical guidelines in their operations and to start working with smaller, local vendors. It wasn't a complete overhaul, but it was a start. Jake didn't feel like he had won. He didn't feel victorious, and he certainly didn't feel like a hero. What he felt was a quiet sense of fulfillment. This wasn't about public accolades or recognition. This was about knowing that he had done what was right, that he had stayed true to his values, no matter how hard the journey had been. As Jake walked out of the building that day, he realized that this was the life he was meant to live. It wasn't about achieving success on someone else's terms. It wasn't about climbing higher, outpacing the competition, or reaching the top. It was about living a life of purpose, of integrity, of love and justice. It was about being part of something bigger than himself. Jake knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, more doubts, and more challenges. But for the first time in his life, he didn't need the world to validate his choices. He had learned to trust himself, to trust his faith, and to know that even in the face of adversity, the power to change the world was within him. And in that moment, he understood what it truly meant to live by faith, not to wait for the world to change, but to be the change, one step at a time. Jake leaned back in his chair, the soft light of the late afternoon filtering through the blinds. His journey, one that had started with confusion, doubt, and a yearning for change, had taken him to places he never expected. He'd fought battles, both internal and external, and while the path hadn't been easy, he had learned lessons he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As he reflected on everything that had happened, he felt a deep sense of peace. No, it hadn't been a perfect journey. There had been losses, moments of uncertainty, and plenty of times when he had questioned whether the fight was worth it. But there had also been moments of clarity, moments of true growth. He had discovered that real change didn't come from fighting the system, it came from changing how you engaged with it. He learned that living by your values wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. His thoughts wandered back to the first day he'd walked into that meeting, to the people who had helped him see the world differently. He thought of Sarah's words, the simple but profound truth that justice, love, and compassion were the forces that could change the world, one small action at a time. It had been a long road, but now he knew what he was meant to do. He was going to continue being that change, wherever it was needed. And as he sat there, contemplating the future, something inside him shifted again. He wasn't finished yet. The journey would continue, and there would be more challenges ahead. But now, Jake had the confidence to face them. He wasn't alone, and neither was anyone else who was willing to walk that path. With a small smile, Jake picked up his phone and typed a message to his followers. It wasn't just a message for himself, but for everyone who had been a part of his story, whether they knew it or not. We've all been on this journey together, and it's far from over. The world needs more people who are willing to stand for what's right, even when it's hard. The question now is, what will you do next? He paused for a moment, then added a final thought. Share your story, ask questions, and keep the conversation going. I want to hear from you. Let's change this world together. What's the one thing you'll do today to make a difference? As he hit send, he leaned back, knowing that the journey ahead wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who was willing to make a stand, big or small. This was only the beginning. If you've been inspired by Jake's journey, if you're ready to take the next step in your own, we want to hear from you. What's your story? How are you changing your world, one action at a time? Drop a comment below, like, and subscribe for more stories about living with purpose, integrity, and love. And don't forget to share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Together, we can be the change we want to see in the world. Let's keep the conversation going. What will you do next?